Hello, and welcome back to Practically Political. As always, it's great to have you. I'm Dave Spencer.
And I'm Carrie Sheffield. Let's get right to it. We've got a special guest today. We're so glad to have her, Miss Gabby Hoffman. Welcome to Practically Political.
Thanks, Carrie. Thanks, Dave.
And so Gabby is our director at Independent Women's Forum of our Energy and Conservation Center, because as good conservatives, we do like to conserve the environment. And she is very well known throughout the industry also on pushing back against ESG and all of the wokeness with DEI taking over the energy industry. And we're finally seeing some relief on that. And we're going to talk about all things Green New Deal and the latest with energy. So Dave, do you want to ask the first question?
Sure. I guess, my first question is, do you believe in climate change, Gabby? Do you think that it's a threat, or what's your thought on that?
I think the climate changes naturally, and it's debatable whether or not it's catastrophic, because we see a lot of proponents kind of pushing the climate crisis narrative, not really abiding by decarbonization themselves. So until they fully abide by decarbonization in their personal lives, I think a lot of skepticism over whether or not we're in a crisis is to be debated. But I think, we just have to adapt to a changing climate, and we have. And I think even with a new administration, you'll see that kind of philosophy, even with them prioritizing energy abundance. But we're not really in a catastrophe, because the people who are calling for it don't seem to be acting like it. So until they change, I think we're okay for now. But I think that doesn't mean you can't care about the environment. I think where we're seeing this kind of shift, and we can go into this certainly more, but we're seeing this in moving away from a climate focus back to kind of a true conservation focus. And as Carrie alluded to, this is something I like to talk about because I am a conservationist through and through. As a hunter and angler, I care very deeply about the environment, and I still think you can balance that with smart energy development. Doesn't mean you have an oil rig at every corner or a solar panel in every field. You have to be very practical and judicious about where you place projects, and you have to assess their trade-offs. But yeah, I think we can recognize that we have a changing climate. How do you mitigate it? Do you do it through top-down directives, or do you do it through innovation? And I think a lot of people are saying that innovation is the smart way to go.
Well, I guess yes. And first of all, look, I always give the benefit of the doubt. As I told Carrie, I hope that I'm wrong about Trump, though the way he started so far, I think I'm been unfortunately right. And I hope he improves the second term. But the environmental record during the Trump administration, first the Trump administration, was abysmal. We can get into that later. But I guess my question, which maybe I didn't hear you answer, there's always been two issues. Is the climate changing, and how much is human activity contributing to that change? So I think even my most ardent climate denier friends now acknowledge that the climate is changing, but they're hesitant to admit that human activity is contributing it. So do you believe that human activity is contributing to climate change, Gabriella?
I would say that of our competitors and adversaries, where there are unchecked powers and their regulations.
I'm asking is it's a simple yes or no question. Do you believe?
I answered. I said.
Okay.
I said the climate is changing naturally. Is it at a catastrophic
level? How much is human activity contributing? I don't recall you answering that. I'm sorry. Maybe I missed it.
It's being debated currently, and I think
how do you feel?
That's how I feel.
Human activity is affecting climate change.
If we're talking about natural disasters.
No, human activity is pumping CO2 into the atmosphere. It's, unregulated fracking where too much methane escapes, which is a far more potent greenhouse gas. That's what I'm asking you. You don't seem to be wanting to answer the question.
No, I'm going to answer your question, if I may. China and Russia and India tend to pollute a lot more than we do. So you have to ask them the question. The United States.
Yes, India, no.
That's debatable. I've seen different information about that, but we, as the United States, across both Democrat and Republican administrations, have done a lot to reduce emissions. I think a top-down approach does not effectively do that. I think a little bit of deregulation and ensuring that you have innovation at the forefront can unleash more of that. And to your point earlier, there was actually a lot of environmental improvement under the Trump administration in several ways. He funded Superfund cleanups. Even Politico, which was not very fond of his policies, gave him a concession and said he did that really well under his EPA the first time. He also permanently funded the Land and Water Conservation Fund, helped to reduce the national park, maintain its backlog, and did a whole host of other measures too, which we could debate. But we can't just scrutinize ourselves. And I think we've done a great job. And even if we're causing catastrophic harm, we have done a lot in the last half century to improve our footprint, to make sure that technologies work great. We're not having people die as much working in the coal, oil, and gas industry, nuclear as well. A lot of safety measures have been taken into account. And as more and more people learn about the energy industry, work in the energy industry, who are also ardent conservationists who hunt and fish, even, those two interests can exist and coincide with one another. People do care about their surroundings. They're just very skeptical about the top-down approaches they've seen, especially from climate posturing and the policies of the previous administration. So you don't have to have this insistence of abiding by a climate catastrophe narrative to care about the environment. And that's the debate we're going to be having, and the policies we're going to see bear out under this administration.
Okay, I still haven't gotten a yes or no answer to my question. Is human activity contribute to climate change? Can you just say yes or no?
It's debatable.
Okay.
And again,
all right, never mind. All right, Carrie, go ahead.
Yeah. So I guess I have two questions for you, Gabby. One, can you explain for our viewers and listeners what we just heard from Lee Zeldin with the EPA and the $20 billion? He said they've found $20 billion in fraud. Explain more about what that is and why that's important. And then I'd love to hear also your thoughts on critical minerals, because from what I understand, I did some, during the Biden administration, I interviewed the governor of Alaska. I interviewed somebody from the Utah Energy Development Organization and also talked to people from Nevada. Joe Biden expanded, he basically did more banning of mining of critical minerals on Nevada land without even talking to the governor of Nevada, which I think it was, just really bad taste. And to me, it seems like Biden was trying to talk out of both sides of his mouth, where he's like, I want to have more critical minerals, which are heavily mined in China. They're dominating that market right now. And yet Biden would not release the federal lands, which is where a lot of these critical minerals are. So what's your take on what we can expect with that? And do you think the United States, because as I understand it, it takes a long time to even get to the minerals, to find where they are, to get the excavate. Like we're so far behind compared to China. Do you think we'll ever catch up?
I'll answer your first point and then address the critical minerals question. But what we're kind of seeing this administration do, which has certainly received a lot of pushback from a lot of climate activists because they're just, used to not having a lot of pushback. But Administrator Zeldin has come into the agency and noticed that there's been this kind of questionable stewarding of government programs and government grants. Where is this $20 billion, the gold bars, as he claimed, coming from? What does it mean? And how is it being stewarded? What initial printing I have seen into it and what has been uncovered so far is a lot of those monies have gone to shell companies or kind of questionable green capital entities who are receiving billions of dollars. And sometimes or what is being uncovered rather, is that they're tied to big financial players in the Democratic Party. And so that is why Administrator Zeldin has placed a lot of scrutiny on these programs. He wants to put the mission of the EPA back to what it's supposed to do, to protect air, water, lands, and make sure that things are responsibly stewarded, not be a slush fund for certain pet projects. And so that might, upset a lot of people who, fight on behalf of the climate or for climate advocacy. But sunlight is the best disinfectant. And if it can lead to the EPA working more effectively, stewarding taxpayer dollars well, I think it's a welcome change, and it won't detract from the agency mission statement. And I think you're seeing all across the board, Department of Energy, Department of Interior, this refocusing back on the mission and not so much putting climate posturing ahead of the intended mission statement of responsible energy development, responsible land conservation. And then to your point about critical minerals, we are certainly behind. And it didn't help that you had, as you said, Carrie, then President Biden talking both sides of the critical minerals issue. He wants to supercharge a clean energy future, but he wanted to rely on minerals that were taken from countries that have worse environmental practices than us, refused to approve most mineral projects, didn't want to approve anything in Alaska, denied a permit in Minnesota with the twin metal mines, the boundaries outside of Arizona, well beyond the national park. A lot of people said it would be in the national park boundaries. It's not. So he really fell into a double-edged sword. But it's not surprising, because that's where I feel like a lot of climate activists are, where they say they really want to catalyze a clean energy future with a lot of intermittent sources. And then they also want to explore minerals. However, they don't want to do it at home, where it could be done safely with more regulations, more scrutiny, and more cooperation between different stakeholders, those on the ground who would be impacted, the local federal administrators who reside in the different states. And so you're right, China does own the majority of processing and refining of rare earth elements, critical minerals. Do we really?
That's because China owns most of the rare earth minerals.
That's true. Yeah, that's where I'm going with that. But to beat them at the competitive edge, we really seeded in that with not competing in this, and I think this is a bipartisan problem. But here, back in the States, you will have to look to see, how do you assess certain mineral projects? Some people support lithium projects. Some people don't support lithium projects. We have a lot of uranium here. We're somehow importing half of our uranium deposits from Russia, which is unheard of. And we should be looking, here to see if that could be done safely. So we can try to help narrow the gap there. I'm not sure we can totally have an advantage over China. That's going to take a lot of unleashing and deregulation, and possibly working with other partners. I think there's discussion about Ukraine, critical minerals, but we have a lot here at home that we could start to source and start to tap into. But it's just a matter of if there's an appetite to do so. So I hope that answers your question, Carrie.
Well, I would, one thing that I say, and Carrie knows, I'm certainly no fan of Joe Biden, but my issue has always been, it seems like we had one party that was all in on fossil fuels and against alternative energy. And then we had another party that was pro-alternative energy, but against fossil fuels. And my question has always been, why can't we do both? Why can't we have maximum fossil fuel production and invest everything we can in alternatives? Because I think, you talk to any power company. And by the way, the reason we've reduced our greenhouse gas emissions overwhelmingly is because we've shifted from coal to natural gas. Okay, which is a bridge fuel, and it's a short-term solution. So we haven't really done that much. In fact, the whole world, frankly, hasn't done squat to reduce our greenhouse emissions. So, but that's another issue. But that's where Biden, I give him credit. He said, let's go full speed in both areas. Let's invest a record amount in alternative fuels, which he did through the Inflation Reduction Act. But let's also drill, baby, drill. And so when he left office, we were producing a record amount of oil. We were producing a record amount of natural gas. And that's the way we should be. And we're now energy independent. We're actually a net exporter of oil. And I think that's great. I've never been against fossil fuels. I think we need to make the transition. What is unhelpful is many people, it seems like you and Trump himself, won't acknowledge that human activity is contributing. Now, climate alarmists have hurt their cause because they've said, if we don't do anything by 2000, we're toast. If we don't do anything by 2020, it's Armageddon, right? And that hasn't happened. So believe me, I think a lot of the environmentalists have been their own worst enemy as someone who's a pragmatist. But I do think we're on the right track. And I'm just hoping, again, when you look at the Trump administration's first term, they gutted wetlands protection. They said, pollute all you want in terms of taking mercury regulations off of power plants. It was just terrible. And he even had a bunch of oil company executives in during the campaign and said, hey, give me $1 billion and I'll do your bidding. Just like for $400 million, he flip-flopped on TikTok. So he's very transactional. So what worries me, again, is that if there's enough money, and the fossil fuel industry still has a lot more money, that we could be in for a rough 4 years.
But to your question, in terms of balancing out oil, natural gas, and reliable, let's say, alternatives, I don't think Republicans would be opposed to that as long as they're reliable, abundant, and secure. And a big thing that we advocate for at my center is nuclear energy. I also am a fan of geothermal where appropriate.
Totally agree. We should be getting a third of our power from nuclear.
Yeah, and I think that's a great middle ground for both sides.
I'm with you on that for sure. And I think that's where the environmentalists and a lot of liberals, I really had a problem because they're thinking of, and first of all, by the way, we've never had anyone die in a nuclear accident in this country. Or maybe about 3 Mile Island, one person died. I can't remember, but it's been incredibly safe. And the new generation of reactors is safer than ever. You don't have the nuclear waste issues, all this stuff. And so this is one area where we need to get off our butts because it should be a much bigger part of our future. What say you, Carrie?
Well, I think I would disagree with you that Republicans have not been all of the
Of course
above.
you would.
I think they are all of the above. I really do.
I remember I asked you to give me one time when you criticized the Trump administration. You said January 6th. I'm like, oh, congratulations. You have to go all the way back to January 6th to think of a time that you criticized Donald Trump. So forgive me for taking those words with a little in a little jest. But go ahead.
Well, coming back to now, I think the other topic I want to get Gabby's take on is the Green New Deal, because by the stroke of his pen with executive orders, Donald Trump canceled a lot of these mandates as much as he could. How much could he do by himself with the pen versus how much does he need Congress? Because as I understand it, a lot of those mandates were lumped in with some of these big, everything in the kitchen sink bills that the Democrats passed last go around when they had both houses of Congress. But what was in those executive orders?
Yes, so he has done a lot, I would say, preliminarily to move away from this kind of net zero posturing to achieve total decarbonization by 2050, which was really hamstringing not only industry, but even environmental goals. And a conservative estimate, I know Heritage Foundation, it's you say conservative source, but they really do have good modeling. They were going off of the magic model from the federal government, which showed that even if you were to achieve or pursue federal Green New Deal objectives, you would only reduce global temperatures by 0.2 of a degree Celsius, not the 1.5 degrees Celsius. So to me, you're potentially upending trillions of dollars of GDP for very marginal environmental gain under the guise of emissions reductions. And so I think President Trump understood that to be the case. He has advisors who are probably telling him that we don't need to comply with the Paris Climate Accords in order to reduce emissions or to promote a cleaner environment. And so as your listeners and viewers know, that even if you do executive action, it's not wholly permanent. Carrie, I know discussions that we have at our organization we're looking to see what's going to be in reconciliation. Is there going to be a permanent codification of no more, re-entry into Paris Accords unless you get congressional approval? That's where it had to be originally. It was never formalized by Congress. It was done by the stroke of a pen, both the entry and exit under Obama and Trump, and then with Biden. And there's also going to be, okay, so how do you make it so you're not doing much of climate posturing when it comes to energy policies, especially with energy efficiency standards, liquefied natural gas export terminals, things of that sort. So what can be done, or what will likely be done? It may be harder to pass in the Senate, but in the House, from what we're initially preening, I think a lot of us are observers wise, they would have to include provisions that kind of reflect what those executive orders do, saying that you can't use climate posturing for household appliances, for energy projects. It has to be more holistic. And so it's going to really take Congress to codify things permanently if he wants to have a lasting impact beyond his 4 years, or to outlast any legal challenges that come through the courts, because a lot of these activists are doing court shopping for friendly courts to try to stall or permanently defeat any executive action from President Trump and his administration. So it's really going to take Congress to make these changes permanent. Certainly, there's going to be a lot of resistance to this. We'll see legally how much he can do. But he may be able to prevail a lot with how these executive orders have been formulated. And we know a couple people behind those, Carrie, who are ensuring that they're going to be not as susceptible to court challenges going off of certain codes and different formulations. So I think that's maybe what you're looking for, but it can't just be a strike of a pen. It really does have to be tackled by Congress now.
Hey, boy, involving Congress, wouldn't that be great? Maybe that would be nice if that's what the administration had done from day one, instead of all these illegal executive orders and DOGE, which is totally illegal. But it will be interesting to see what's going to happen on the front. But I just want to say, of course you disagree, Carrie. But I just want to say this Green New Deal thing, this is classic MAGA hyperbole. It's like Medicare for all, okay? I'm going to win the Boston Marathon before either one of those become law. And it's just ridiculous. These are what a few quacks, people that were trying to get votes in the 2020 primary who have since renounced it, have said. So as far as energy policy goes, I do think we need a combination. I think we all agree, a combination of alternative fuels. But you talk to energy companies, like Southern Energy, for example, is the second largest company in the country. And they said that they've gone from about 75% coal down to about 20% coal. And they think between 2040 and 2050, you talk to most energy companies, and these are people that I think are good people to talk to because they're dealing with it, right? They're dealing with profits and losses and jobs and all this stuff. So between 2040 and 2050 is when you're going to have most energy companies be carbon free. And I think economically, that's what makes sense. And they're making the transition. Yes, they want to be environmental stewards, but mostly it's just cost savings because it's much more efficient with natural gas. You have fewer employees. You've got a lot of other benefits. But I think the government should not, like in California, banning gas-powered cars by 2035. Stupid idea. I'm a free market guy. I think let the free market handle it, and it will. But so you have, again, two extremes. You have one information that interferes with the alternative energy or doesn't support that market, and then you have another more liberal people that try to mandate getting rid of fossil fuels. And I think both of those are a terrible idea. I think the free market works just fine in this case.
It does, but the Inflation Reduction Act did a lot to bungle the market and tip the scales unfairly into unreliable solar and wind. And we're now seeing the consequences.
They're not unreliable. The sun is one of the most reliable things around. I think that's
solar only works 25% of the year, wind about 35%.
Well,
that's according to the EIA.
Well, that depends where you are. If you're on the equator, that's not true because the sun is strong there all year round. And if you're in the southern hemisphere, obviously that's when it's working more than it's working in the northern hemisphere. So that's a specious stat. But putting that aside,
Dave, how do you
right now
the
challenge is the storage. The challenge is the storage capabilities, right? In California, I heard a stat that there's like 5 minutes worth of storage for what the state needs. So again, all of this, it's a transition. We should be doing both. It's kind of like when they take you off a drug, right? They ramp you down. So I think for the next probably 25 years, 15 to 25 years, we're going to be using fossil fuels for energy, and eventually we'll ramp it down. But that's something that, again, the market should decide. And I think certainly helping the Inflation Reduction Act, like anything, that's my problem with DOGE and, or organizations like USAID, which the autocrats around the world are cheering its demise because it's one of our most important ways to project soft power. But yes, out of $40 billion, you can always find $1 billion that's been misspent. But what I thought was very interesting is when you look at, say, you watch Hannity, and he's having this scroll of all these programs. He's talking like 1.5 million for this, 4.9 million for this, 70,000 for this. I mean, there's such infinitesimal drops in the bucket on the overall budget. And people saying, oh, we're going to cut $1 trillion. Well, if you're really serious about cutting the deficit, let's see you pare back that $5 trillion tax cut. But I don't see that happening anytime soon. But getting back to energy, I do think that as long as we can go full speed ahead on both tracks, I think we'll be okay. And we're in a great situation energy-wise. That's why when the price of oil went up, we didn't have inflation as much the way we did in the past, because unlike a lot of our competitors, we're now energy independent, whereas they're energy dependent.
Yeah, but that wasn't because of Biden's policies. He kept a lot of oil and gas in the ground, and those were leases that were grandfathered in from Trump's first administration.
Were we drilling a record amount when he left office or not?
Yes, but that's because the market supply and demand dictates that. That's not because Biden's policies invited.
He got off to a bad start, but he recovered. I agree.